let's talk a little bit about the different kinds of honeybee races. And this is important because now we're really going to start getting into what's involved with becoming a beekeeper. So the first thing you have to think about is, well, what kind of honeybee am I going to start with? And there are many different types of races of honeybees. And, you know, no two people are the same. So what you want from why you are raising honeybees might help dictate which honeybee race you might choose. So I'm just showing you here on this slide the 4 most common races of honeybees that you will probably be able to find commercially, because that's important. If you can find these locally, that's great. But oftentimes you're probably going to find yourself ordering them through the mail, or maybe even having to drive out of state to pick up your honeybees. So let's start with the Italian bee, which is on the upper left of the screen. Italian bees are probably the most popular bee, and probably the most popular bee for beginning beekeepers. The reason being they're gentle. They have a reputation of being very gentle. They're also very good honey producers. So if the reason that you want to become a beekeeper is to produce honey, well, Italians are a good choice. Now keep in mind that there are some people that keep bees not so much because they're interested in honey production, but it's maybe you're an orchardist. You have a lot of apple trees. Or fruit, or other types of fruit trees, and you want the bees there for pollination. Now, they're easy to order. Italians are easy to find. You can probably find them locally, no matter where you live. They're light in color. A couple things, though, about Italian bees. First of all, they do have a tendency to swarm. By swarming, I mean, what happens sometimes in a beehive, in a commercial beehive, is that sometimes the population of bees may get a little too large. And maybe you're not keeping up the population, the size of the population by adding more frames to your brood chambers. And in certain cases, when it could be overpopulation, the queen and about half of the worker bees decide to flee the beehive and start a new hive elsewhere. So Italian bees do have a little bit of a reputation for tending to swarm. And keep in mind, now you've lost the queen in your hive, and you have to hope that the remaining bees will start producing a new queen, or you may have to go out and purchase a new queen for your hive. Italian bees are adapted. They come from Italy. Not a surprise. And they come from a part of Italy that is warm. So Italian bees may not be the best choice for northern climates. During very cold winters, Italian bees may not survive. However, they certainly can. So that is one knock against Italian bees. If you live in a very cold climate, you might want to think about a different type of honeybee race. Below the Italian bee is a picture of a buckfast honeybee. Now, buckfast, they are a hybrid that was developed in the United Kingdom. They are good honey producers. They're known as being gentle, even though I have to admit I've had my fair share of buckfast honeybees over the years, and sometimes I don't find them maybe quite as gentle as some people say. They don't tend to swarm. That's a good thing. They don't tend to swarm. And being from the UK, they are pretty well adapted to climate like we have here in Michigan, you know, where we have some cool, damp months of the year, okay? And then, of course, we have winter. So they are probably able to withstand our winter temperatures a little bit better than, let's say, an Italian bee. Their color is a yellow-brown color. In the upper right, we have pictures of Russian bees, and you can see the color of a Russian bee is much darker. They are good honey producers. They come from Eurasia. And the reason that Russian bees have become so popular, let's say in the last couple decades for beekeepers, is because of the Varroa mite. And we're going to talk about the Varroa mite and other things that cause stress in honeybees in a little bit. But one of the worst stress factors on honeybees is the Varroa mite. And the Varroa mite comes from Eurasia. It entered into the United States several decades ago, and it's wreaked havoc in a lot of our beekeeping industry. The nice thing about the Russian bees is that they come from the same area as the Varroa mite, Eurasia. And they've already developed a sort of a resistance to the Varroa mite, which makes them a popular choice if you're finding that Varroa mites tends to be a constant problem with your beekeeping. They're, being from Eurasia, they're also adapted to cool climates, which makes them very suitable for here in Michigan. Now, one of the knocks on the Russian bees is that they're known as being aggressive. Well, I have to admit, I've had Russian bees over the years, and I really don't find them any more aggressive than, let's say, a buckfast. So, sometimes stress will force bees to become aggressive. Okay, bees tend to be defensive, not offensive, but they will defend their hives. So if there are stress, if the bees are stressed, they will tend to be a little bit more aggressive, and so keep that in mind. That just about any honeybee race can be aggressive at times. And one thing about Russian bees is that they oftentimes will benefit from you planting a lot of food source around the beehives, whether it be a large plot of buckwheat, which I'll show you in a little while. But sometimes planting an additional food source for Russian bees can be helpful. Now, keep in mind when we talk about bees and foraging for pollen and nectar, bees will forage a mile or more away from their nest. So it's not absolutely necessary that you surround your beehives with all kinds of flowering plants or flowering trees, okay? Because they are able to forage a mile or so and then return to the nest with what they find. The last of these honeybee races I'm going to talk about today is the carnelians, or we call them carnies. They're also fairly easy to find, just like the Italian, the buckfast, and the Russians. You should be able to find them. If not locally, you can buy them. You can find them online, or if you want, maybe you drive to another state and pick them up yourself. But they're good. They're okay honey producers. They're known to be very gentle. They tend to overwinter well. They can swarm. They're darker colored, kind of darker colored like the Russian bees. Okay, but with some spots and bands on the upper side of their abdomen. And these carnelians, they come from Italy as well, but northern Italy. They actually come from the Alps, the Italian Alps region. So they, like I said, they are a little bit better suited to our Michigan winters. Now, there are other honeybee races that you will probably be able to find online. And choose one that suits your need. Are you looking for gentleness? Are you looking for high honey production? Are you looking for ability to overwinter? Are you looking for resistance to Varroa mite? Okay, those are all the things that you must consider when you're choosing your honeybee races. And if you're going to be starting off with multiple hives, you don't have to start with all the same honeybee race. You can mix them up. So let's talk a little bit about stress factors. I talked about one of the biggest stress factors for our honeybee populations is the Varroa mite. And I'm sure a lot of you have read stories, read newspaper articles, magazine articles, or listened to radio reports about how we're having a honeybee collapse in our country. We're losing our honeybees. It's becoming more and more difficult for honeybees in our northern climates to overwinter. We're seeing losses of honeybee hives on the rate of 40% or higher 40 to 60% during the winter here up in our northern climates. You know, there are a lot of different things that go into honeybee stress. The Varroa mite is certainly one. But also there are other things like loss of habitat. You know, as we continue to develop our land and suburban sprawl and so forth, you know, yeah, we tend to lose a lot of our native flora and native trees that support bee populations. There are also other pathogens besides the mites that can cause problems with our honeybees, and those are bacteria and fungi. And we'll talk a little bit about bacteria in a little bit. Climate and weather, extremely cold winters, extremely wet winters, those can cause problems for a beehive. So there are, and then finally pesticide use. You know, a lot of indiscriminate pesticide use, especially those type of pesticides which are called neonicotinoids, are wreaking havoc on our bee populations. So those are all the things that are contributing to a decline in bee health and a loss of hives or colony collapse. So let's talk a little bit more about the Varroa mite. The picture on the left, that is a picture of a Varroa mite. Now mites are not insects. Insects, you know, have six legs. As you can see, the Varroa mite, all mites have 8 legs. Oh, and these Varroa mites are not very small. If you look in the picture on the right of a honeybee, you can see the mite attached to the thorax, of the honeybee. And there's also one on the abdomen and one below it. You can't see it quite as well, but you can see that honeybee there has gone out and foraged. During its foraging, it has collected 2 Varroa mites on its body and brought them back into the hive. And as you can see, the honeybee is tending to the brood in the hive, to the brood cells. And what's going to happen is that once these Varroa mites get into the hive, they're going to lay their own eggs, and they're going to lay them into the honeycomb cells. And when these Varroa mite eggs turn into larvae, they are going to destroy the bee larvae in the hive. So that's the problem with the Varroa mite. Now, the good thing is, yes, you can treat for Varroa mite, and there are different methods of Varroa mite treatment. The one that is probably the most popular amongst beekeepers is using oxalic acid. Oxalic acid is a white powder, and the way you treat a hive for Varroa mites using oxalic acid is that you vaporize the powder. So you have a heating element, and there are different styles, and you heat the oxalic acid powder, and it vaporizes, turns into a gas. And then the gas fills the chambers of the hive, and you need to do repeated treatments with oxalic acid. Usually you do 3 or more treatments to kill the Varroa mites. Some other problems that you will encounter possibly as a beekeeper besides the Varroa mite, the one on the right I want to talk about first, because that's probably one of the next most common problems you might encounter, and I hope you don't, though, and that's called foul brood. Now, there are 2 types of foul brood. There's one called European, and there's one called North American foul brood. They're both caused by bacteria, but different bacteria. And what happens is the bacteria infect the brood cells and kill the eggs, kill the developing larvae. And the way you can test for foul brood is if you were to take, let's say, like a toothpick and dip it into a honeycomb cell, a brood cell that you suspect is infected with foul brood, and you dip that toothpick in and you pull it out, it will be a stringy mess a streamy, kind of a brownish color, stringy liquid attached to the toothpick as you pull it out. So that's an indication that you have foul brood. There are foul brood test kits that you can purchase commercially, okay? So you can verify that you have foul brood. I sincerely hope you never encounter foul brood in your beekeeping activities. If you do, really the only recourse is to destroy the equipment, destroy those frames or whatever, burn them that have been infected with foul brood. So it's a very nasty thing. On the left is a problem you may encounter as a beekeeper, and that's the waxworm, the wax moth. The wax moth will lay eggs, which will become larvae, and they will make this stringy web nest all over the inside of your hive, on your frames. Now, the webworm, this waxworm, it doesn't necessarily kill the larva. However, it makes a real mess of things, and it's easily treatable. You can just anything that's been infected by the waxworm larva or moth, you can just put those pieces in the freezer and freeze them, because the waxworm cannot survive the winter. So if you were to take those infected pieces of equipment and store them in the freezer, you can kill the waxworm and its larva. So the waxworm is usually more of a storage problem. So make sure when you're storing your equipment, make sure it's hopefully in a shed or a trailer that is locked tight, so you can prevent things like wax moths from getting into your equipment, and also mice. Mice are another real problem that you might encounter too when you're storing your equipment, especially during the winter time. So try to store your beekeeping equipment in some Loctite sheds or trailers. Okay, so let's now get into what a commercial beehive looks like. And this would be a picture. This is a picture from my backyard. This one would have been taken later in the year, late summer, because as you can see, we have several. Our hives are stacked several boxes high. If you count, you can see that they have 4 boxes. And I am going to get into what the equipment that you need to have, okay, in order to become a successful beekeeper. Well, in the last slide, I showed you a picture of what hopefully your beehives will look like later in the summer, early fall, when you're ready to harvest your honey. So what I want to spend time on right now is how you get there. What are all the things you have to consider in order to have a successful honey production year? So let's begin with the basics. There is some equipment you're going to need to purchase before you start. And number one would be a bee suit. Now, there are different kinds of bee suits. When I originally started beekeeping, I had the more traditional full cotton cloth bee suit. But what I found out is that when you're out there on the hot summer days with the sun beating down on you, it can get very hot inside those cloth-covered bee suits. So I've recently switched to these ventilated poly bee suits now. So you'll need to buy gloves as well. And of course, with these poly suits, they come with an attached zippered hood. So whereas with the old traditional bee suits, you had a separate hat to wear. So I recommend the ventilated bee suits for you. Now, not everyone likes full-length bee suits. There are a lot of beekeepers that will only wear a waist-length top. So it's your choice. Besides your bee suit, probably the most indispensable tool that you're going to need as a beekeeper is what we call the hive tool. And it's a pry bar. And I would suggest you buy 2 or 3 of these, because whenever you're out there working with your bees, you're going to need this. And it's easy to displace it sometimes, so have 2 or 3 on hand. That's the hive tool. Another piece of equipment that comes in handy is the smoker. Now, you're not always going to need your smoker every time you're out there doing something with your bees. However, when you're taking apart your beehives and really reaching down and looking at your frames, pulling them up and looking at your frames, it's a good idea, okay, to have a smoker. Now, the reason for a smoker is that it tends to calm the bees. So there are different kinds of fuels that you can load into a smoker. Some people just make their own with pine needles and little pieces of wood shavings and so forth. Or you can buy commercial, okay? You can buy commercial fuels for your smoker. But it works, it's a bellows, okay, that will push, once it's lit, will push the smoke, and you spread it around your bees and gives them a little bit of a calming effect. So those are a couple indispensable items that you'll need as a beekeeper. All right, so you've ordered your bees. What do they look like when they are shipped to the post office and you go pick them up at the post office, or whether you're going and picking them up yourself in person? What do the bees come in? Well, traditionally, they come in a wire cage like this. And this wire cage will have about 10,000 bees, worker bees, female worker bees in it. And it also comes with this can, which is full of sugar water, okay, for nourishment during the transportation of your bees to your local post office, or when you're driving home with them from wherever you pick them up. Besides the 10,000 worker bees inside your nest here is the queen bee. The queen comes separate. The queen comes in a container, oftentimes looking like this. Sometimes it might be a plastic container. But the queen is separated from the worker bees because the worker bees need time to accept the mated queen bee. Remember, I talked before about the queen bee giving off pheromones. It takes a little time for these worker bees to accept the queen. Because if the worker bees do not accept the queen, when you put them all together in the hive, they might kill your queen bee. So that's very important on how you introduce the queen to your hive. So let's kind of look at what all goes into a commercial beehive. And there are different examples, but this is the one that is probably most commonly used by most beekeepers. Let's start from the bottom up. Let's start with your bottom board. Your bottom board is a screen, okay, a bottom screen that all your boxes are going to rest on top of. And inside, in the back of your bottom board, you see that there is a slot where, of course it's not going to come out, there's a slot with this, what we often call a sticky board. And the nice thing about the sticky board is it's painted white. So if you're ever doing a mite count on your colony, the dead mites will land on the sticky board, and then you can count them, get an idea how bad your Varroa mite infestation is. Also, this is a good protector from cold. So this is the bottom board. And now you get into your boxes. Now you get into your hive boxes. And there are different heights of hive boxes, okay? This is the size that I use. And your hive box will sit on top of your bottom board, like so. And then inside of your hive box will be your frames. Now, frames come plastic or wood, okay? Plastic or wood frames, it's your choice. But you can see that when you purchase your frames, they'll come with this plastic honeycomb. They'll come with this plastic honeycomb grid, okay? And this is what the bees will use for either honey, pollen, or brood. Now, the way I do it is when you're starting off with your new bees, I set 4 or 5 frames inside the box. Then after I then add the bees, okay, into the box and shake them. I then have a second box above it, also with 4 or 5 frames in it. So these 2 bottom boxes will be my brood boxes. So this is where the queen will lay its brood, okay, and develop into new bees. So usually you start with 2 boxes high just for brood. Now, once you've got your bees in there, the second thing you have to do is insert the queen. Now, the queen's going to have a plug at both ends. There's going to be a plug, and what you can do is you can remove one of the plugs and then set your queen in between a couple of the frames, like so. And then the other end is filled, the other hole is filled with a candy, with like a sugar water candy. And the queen, after about 1 or 2 days, will eat through the candy, chew its way through the candy, and then will enter the hive along with the worker bees you've introduced. Then after about 2-3 days, you go back, you go in and you make sure that the queen has come out, okay, has released itself, that it's not still in there. If it's still in there and it's alive, you might need to help it and remove the queen. But that's how you introduce the queen. Like I said before, you have to give the worker bees time to accept your queen bee. So pretend that you have 2 boxes high, and those are your brood chambers, and things are going well. Things are going well in your hive, and then you want to start your honey production. The first thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need to put a queen excluder, okay, over the top brood box. The reason for the excluder is that you want your worker bees to be able to come up through, but you don't want your queen to be able to migrate out of the brood box up into your honey boxes. Because the only thing you're going to want in your honey boxes is honey. You don't want any brood laid there. So when the time is right and you want to start your honey production, put your excluder, okay, on top of the top brood box. And then you can put a telescopic lid, okay, over the top, okay, and that's how you build your frames, your boxes. Now there are some additional boxes that you can add to your hive. One is a feeder, okay. This is a feeder, and this would go on top. After you've introduced your bees, you can set this on top, okay, and fill it with sugar water. Fill it with sugar water, and that gives a nutritional source for your bees early in the year. If you're starting your bees in April or early May, there are still Yes, there are flowers, there are fruiting trees and so forth available for nectar and pollen, but you will need to help help them with a head start in the spring by filling this with sugar water. Another thing to consider is for winter time, and this is something that you would use to reduce moisture in your hive during the cold months. And this would sit on top, so instead of a feeder box, this would sit on top of your top box, and you would fill this screened quilting box with the cedar shavings or pine shavings. And the idea being that the shavings will absorb any moisture within your hive. So that's something you might want to consider doing for as you head into the winter. Some other tools that are handy. This is a spacer. Now it's very important, especially when you're talking about your super frames, okay, that you space them out evenly, okay, and that's what this is for. You can use this spacer, okay, to space your frames evenly, and that way you won't get a lot of buildup between the frames in your box, in your super boxes. Now notice this material here that's on this queen excluder, and also you can see it on top of some of the frames. This is called propolis, and this is a material that the bees collect from plants. A lot of times flower buds will be coated in a resinous material, or oftentimes when a plant is injured during the healing process, it will release this resins, okay, to cover the wound in the plant. And the bees will take that resin, and they'll bring it back. They'll bring it back to the hive, and they'll actually use it like a glue. They will use it to glue any openings in between your boxes and so forth. So this is very beneficial, okay? Very, very beneficial. But also, it can get very sticky, and it can make getting your boxes and frames apart a little bit more difficult. But that's why you have the hive tool. When you're later in the year, when you're trying to get your supers off, off of your hive, the bees, you'll have lots of bees up in the supers with the honey. And so you need to get the bees to vacate the supers. And the easiest way is to use a spray. Okay, you open up your hive and you spray down into your super. You give the bees time to migrate down further into the lower boxes of the hive. And one of the things I use is a Bee Quick. It's like an almond extract. It smells very good. They have other ones too, which don't smell very good, but they're also effective in chasing the bees out of the super. So then you can just lift it up, okay, and bring it to wherever you're processing your honey. All right, now that you have a basic idea of the equipment you're going to need and a little bit about the step-by-step process of turning your hive into a successful honey operation, I can just quickly go through some of these slides. Again, here is that nest box that the bees are going to arrive in. As I mentioned before, about 10,000 bees, worker bees. And there you can see I'm placing it into the hive box. There's the queen. There's the queen cell. Okay, inserting it in between a couple of the frames in the lower hive box. Okay, so after you've added your worker bees, you've added your queen, your beehives are 2 boxes high, and they're ready to start. In the queen, you're now just waiting for the queen to start laying brood. Okay, and then later in the summer, okay, you're going to be adding those supers. So the bottom two boxes of each of those stacks, those are your brood chambers. Above the second brood chamber, of course, is that queen excluder. And those boxes on top of that, those are your honey supers. So the queen cannot get into it, just the worker bees, and they're going to fill all those frames in those boxes, those upper boxes, with honey. And each one of those boxes, if you use 9 frames per box, you can expect anywhere from about 25 pounds or so of honey production in each one of those boxes. As I mentioned before, it's not absolutely necessary to plant a pollen and a nectar source around your hives. As I mentioned before, the bees can forage up to a mile away looking for food. But I do plant. I plant a field of buckwheat around my beehives as a constant source of nectar and pollen for the bees throughout the summer into early fall. So here are a couple frames from supers. So these are loaded with honey, and the bees, after the bees fill the honeycombs with honey, they cap it with a wax. They'll cap the cells with a wax coating. And you can see in these pictures on the left, I've partially removed the wax covering on one of the frames, just so you can see the difference. And then on the one on the right, all of the wax covering has been removed, and now the frame is ready for spinning to extract the honey. So there are different kinds of extractors. This is what I have at home. Basically, it's a centrifuge. You can hook these centrifuges up to a motor if you want and motorize them. I just crank them by hand. As you can see, there's a crank up there. And you can load 8 of these honey-filled frames into the extractor at one time, and then you start cranking, okay? And as you crank and as it centrifuges, the honey will come out of the frames, okay? And then you collect it in a bucket with a sieve on top, okay? You want to make sure that you sieve your honey, in between going into your bucket. But that's all you need to do. There is no further processing. If you're talking about having raw honey, there is no further processing than just spinning your frames, letting it flow through a sieve to take out any bee particles and other particles into a bucket. Usually you let the honey sit for a few days to clarify, and then you are ready to start pouring it into bottles, okay? So a pound of honey weighs this is a 1 pound bottle, just to give you an idea. That's about 1 pound, and this is 2 pounds of honey. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about honey then, and what makes honey different from nectar. As you know, the bees, some of the worker bees, the worker foraging bees, they go out in search of nectar and pollen. So they bring back a liquid to the hive, which is nectar, which is about 80% water. It's thin, it's colorless, and it has complex sugars. So once they bring it into the hive, what happens is that some of the worker bees will regurgitate. Okay, the bees bring it into the hive. They've swallowed the nectar. It's in the crop or the intestine of their body. They'll come back into the hive, and then they'll regurgitate it, and they'll pass it from one worker bee to another. And during the process, you start losing water. Okay, so it starts to thicken, and then they will pack this thickened nectar into the honeycomb cells, and they will fan it with their wings, and that will aid more evaporation of the water. So with fanning and regurgitation, this 80% water fluid now has become what we call honey, which is 15 to 18% water instead of 80% water. It's very viscous. It has an amber color. And instead of complex sugars, it has very simple sugars, glucose and fructose. Now, remember, the bees will then cap, once it's become honey, the bees then will cap it with a wax covering, as I showed you before. One last word about beekeeping, and if you live in a climate like Michigan, you may want to think about how to winterize your hives to get them through the winter. You know, I did talk about the quilting box, where that's the one where you can add shavings, cedar shavings, pine shavings to absorb moisture in your hive during the wintertime. Another thing that I do is I take my hives, I wrap them in black roofing paper. I wrap roofing paper around them, staple it together. The black paper will, on a sunny day, will absorb the sun, absorb heat, and help a little bit in trying to keep the bees warm. What the bees will do during the wintertime is that they will huddle together in a tight mass. And some races of honeybees are better at tightly packing together than others, but that's what they do in the wintertime. They will huddle together and pack in a small area as possible to stay warm. Okay, and through vibration, they'll stay warm. So good luck, everyone. I hope some of these tips on how to become a beekeeper are helpful for you. Before you actually go out and purchase bees, let me direct you through some references that I think that you should consider. And even on top of using some of these references, really seek out a beekeeper in your area, or join a beekeeping association. We have lots of beekeeping associations in Michigan, so don't try to do everything on your own. Try to seek other beekeepers for advice on how to do things. A couple of books that I've listed some books here. If you want to learn more about our native bees, this book by Heather Holm called Identification and Native Plant Foraging Guide, I highly recommend that if you want to learn more about our native bees. And then if you, for the beekeepers, there are lots of books on the market. A couple that I'm going to recommend to you, one by Kim Flodham is The Backyard Beekeeper, and the other one is by James Tu, and that is Beekeeper's Problem Solver. So maybe come to the library and check them out, or pick up a copy of your own and learn more about beekeeping, and then seek out some help from an established beekeeper. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining with me, and all I can say is happy beekeeping. Thank you.